Chapter 1. Caught the Dragon. The first sensation of which Nicholas Wade became aware was something warm and wet on the back of his head. His hand moved seemingly of its own volition to the area, and he felt the dampness on his fingertips. He had no idea from where the dampness had originated or its reason for being. He knew simply that the back of his head was wet. He tried to draw his hand back and have a look at the liquid on his fingers, but his arm resisted the commands from his brain. The appendage moved slowly, clumsily, and something, he knew not what, seemed to be in the way. The second thing of which he became aware was the strobe lights that flashed somewhere on the other side of his eyelids. Why were his eyes closed? He tried to open them, but something wet and sticky frustrated his attempt. In the brief moment when he managed to get his left eye one quarter open, he could see nothing but a red haze. Sounds began to intrude upon him. He had much difficulty sorting through them. Voices. The sound of many footsteps. A strange crunching sound he could best describe as Rice Krispies after milk has been added to the bowl. Softer, distant voices that sounded like walkie-talkie chatter. He also became aware of the pressure on his right shoulder and his abdomen. A seatbelt? That had to be it. He had been in the passenger seat of Angie's Mustang. That much he remembered. Was he still there? The evidence of the seatbelt seemed to suggest just that. But why could he not remember? And why did his eyes and arm defy his commands? Several of the voices closest to him faded in and out. He caught a word here, bad, and a partial phrase there, jaws of life. But he seemed unable to string them together into a coherent sentence. He wished he could open his eyes. The multicolored strobes that flashed around him were all that prevented him from existing in complete darkness. He heard another voice, very close. He felt warm breath on his right ear. Nick could not understand what the voice told him, but part of him recognized the reassuring tone. There was unexpected pressure on his right hand. He tried to recoil from it, but it seemed his hand had not yet ended its rebellion. He could not pull away. A moment after the man took Nick's hand in his own, there was a loud thud that seemed to come from all around him. The whine of machinery, a small motor suddenly pressed into service, the sound of thin metal crumpling and finally tearing. The cacophony did not so much fade out as it ended abruptly. More of the serial noise, more voices, and then more hands, grasping his arms and legs, one cradling his head. The sensation of being weightless. He felt cool air on his arms, his face, and of course, the warm wetness on the back of his head that now reached his neck. Male voices, frantic. He wished he could understand them. A female voice that spoke only two words, "Call it." Nick felt himself come back to earth as the people holding him placed him on the ground. No, not the ground. Something soft, and with a pillow. A bed? The sensation of being moved rolled, the squeak of a bad wheel like on a shopping cart. The last thing of which he would be aware for some time was another voice. It was deep and tinged with a Hispanic accent. "You just remember Santos. Santos got what you need." Nick would not realize, until he awoke in the hospital, that this last voice did not belong to anyone around him. It was a memory, and not a particularly pleasant one. The first thing he did when he came to was open his eyes. They obeyed him now, although he did not know why that should be noteworthy. When had they ever given him trouble before? He saw a young woman's face looming over him, and he recognized the owner of that face immediately. "Rebecca?" he whispered. His throat felt raw, dry. His cousin smiled at him and clasped his right hand in hers. "Hey, Nicky," she said. Her smile widened. "How are you feeling?" He swallowed, and it hurt to do so. He tried to see around her, but sudden pain lanced through his neck. "Don't try to move. Don't try to move," Rebecca told him. "You're wearing a neck brace." She looked him up and down. "Among other things." His eyes moved down, and he took in his prone body. He lay in a hospital bed. His right leg was sheathed in a cast from ankle to thigh. His left hand was wrapped in a bandage. Poking out of the top of his right hand and between Rebecca's fingers was an IV. His eyes followed the tube up to the plastic bag half filled with a clear solution hanging from a metal pole. After a moment, he returned his gaze to Rebecca. "Hospital." It was not a question. She nodded and squeezed his hand. "You're lucky to be breathing, Nicky. It was pretty bad from what I hear." Nick closed his eyes and tried to figure out just how the hell he had wound up in the hospital. He tried for what felt like several moments, but he came up empty. Finally, he looked at Rebecca again. "What happened?" "You were in a car accident, a bad one. How much do you remember?" Her smile remained in place, but even in his current state, he could see it was forced. He swallowed again, winced at the pain. "How did it happen?" Rebecca's smile faltered. It was her turn to swallow. She looked away, out the window to his right. He followed her gaze. His room was apparently high up. He could see the cityscape far below. Cars zipped back and forth along the stretch of highway, perhaps a half-mile distant. The sun was beginning its downslide behind the foothills on the horizon. Rebecca continued to stare out the window. Her grip on his right hand loosened. "Bex," Nick whispered. When her eyes met his again, he saw they were wet. There were no tears, but it looked as if some might be on the way. He nodded as much as the neck brace would allow. "Tell me what happened." Rebecca bit her lip. "I don't know everything. The cops are still investigating, I think." She stood and began a slow orbit around the room. "It was bad, Nicky, very bad. 2 days ago, you were involved in a single-vehicle collision. I heard from a cop when I got here that they had a priest ready to give you last rites." Her smile returned, but it was weak, a shadow of its former self. "But you pulled through. That's all that matters." Nick's brow furrowed. "I remember." His voice trailed off. The truth was, he could not remember a thing. Not really. He closed his eyes and concentrated. The fog that usually obscured his memory after he successfully caught the dragon seemed thicker than usual. Most of the time, he could catch glimpses of scattered images. This time, he could see nothing but the fog. He squeezed his eyes tighter and felt his free hand curl into a fist. The IV tube pulled a little against the tape securing it to the back of his hand. The uncomfortable and unfamiliar sensation might serve to blow away some of the fog. Success. He caught a glimpse of himself ascending the stairs to Santos's apartment. The staircase was dark and dirty. An ancient strip of carpet ran along the center of the steps. It was threadbare, and its original color was anybody's guess. Paint peeled freely from the walls. Nick had been in plenty of other houses similar to this, but he had never been in this one. He was uneasy. He remembered that clearly. He had never met Santos, and was only here because his usual dealer was taking a sabbatical in Danbury, courtesy of the feds. He remembered knocking on the door on the second floor, being invited in. He remembered the overall shabbiness and shittiness of Santos's apartment. He remembered the gap-toothed grin on Santos's weathered face as Nick forked over the cash. And he remembered Santos's parting shot as Nick closed the door behind him and descended the stairs. You just remember Santos. Santos got what you need. The fog threatened to cover everything else, but Nick clenched his fist tighter. His fingernails dug deeply into his palm. He heard Rebecca say, "Nicky?" He ignored her and concentrated on the pain in his hand. It could not burn through all the fog, but it found him a small opening where it was not quite so thick. He sat in the front seat of the Mustang. Something from Avenged Sevenfold played over the speakers. He held the empty toilet paper roll to his mouth and inhaled as deeply as he could. He tasted the sweet smoke and felt it work its way down his throat. It was always his second favorite part of the whole ritual. The first was afterwards, when it kicked in. He remembered sitting all the way back in the seat and holding his breath. He eventually released that breath as a steady stream of smoke out the window. Then it was his turn to hold the tin foil and light its contents for Angie. "Angie?" he whispered. Nick opened his eyes and looked at Rebecca. His look of concern was quickly replaced by one of dread. "Where's Angie?" Rebecca swallowed. "Nicky." She swallowed again. Nick sat up in the bed. Pain lanced through his leg, his arm, and his neck. Nick whimpered and lay back down as gently as he was able. When the pain was once again manageable, he returned his attention to Rebecca. "Bex, where's Angie? Is she okay?" He did not like the look in his cousin's eyes. She let go of his hand and took a few slow steps away from the bed. She faced the door and folded her arms across her chest. She started and stopped a few times before she was able to speak. "She's gone, Nicky. She didn't make it." A pause. I'm so sorry, honey." Nick blinked at her. He released a breath he was unaware he held. "Jesus, that can't be right," he said after a long moment. His head remained on the pillow, but he looked at Rebecca. "She was only 28, for Christ's sake." His voice became louder and took on an edge. "Tell me this is all a joke, Rebecca, because if it's true..." "It's true." Rebecca turned and faced him again. "Jesus, do you think I'd make that up?" She advanced a few steps and stopped at the foot of the bed. "You were in a bad car accident, Nicky. And from what I overheard the cops say, you should feel pretty goddamn lucky you weren't the driver. As it is, you're in deep enough shit without that, too." She paused long enough to swallow again. "They found all this paraphernalia in the car. I'm sure they ran blood work on you, and I'm just as sure they found something. Didn't they?" Now it was her voice that took on an edge. "Didn't they?" Nick looked away. Rebecca turned in anger, but it seemed to last only a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured. "I figured as much when the nurse told me they were giving you methadone instead of oxy-whatever, because I'm pretty sure they only give you methadone when the patient is a heroin addict. Even I know that." She shook her head. "Your parents died from that shit, Nicky. Why are you in such a fucking hurry to follow in their footsteps?" She walked around the bed and took her original spot. She clasped his hand. "Your blood, and I love you. But you can't keep this up. No one can." She leaned over him and looked into his eyes. "Your girlfriend is dead, Nick. This is your wake-up call. Because the next time my phone rings, it'll be the cops asking me to ID your body." Nick looked into her eyes for only a moment before he turned away as much as the neck brace would allow. Can I be alone for a few? She let go of his hand. Only for a few. There's a detective outside, and I'm sure he's going to want to talk to you. You'd better be straight with him, Nicky. You'd better be straight. He heard her soft footsteps retreat from the room. As Rebecca predicted, it was no more than a few moments later when a man in jeans and a sport jacket entered the room. He knocked on the door as he walked past it. "Nicholas?" He did not await a reply as he made his way to the foot of the bed. "I'm Detective Connolly, Philadelphia PD. I need to speak with you." Nick turned his eyes to the foot of the bed. Connolly was an older man with receding brown hair. He wore a white polo shirt beneath the sport coat. The coat looked to be a size too small. The man's tree-trunk arms strained against the fabric, and Nick could clearly see the bulge in the man's side where his weapon rested in its holster. His gold badge was clipped to the waistline of his jeans. The two men stared at each other for a moment before Nick said, "What do you want?" Connolly produced a small notepad from his back pocket and a pen from behind his ear. "I want you to tell me what happened 2 nights ago, as much as you can remember." He smiled. Nick did not buy into the smile for a moment. He was a veteran of too many arrests and interrogations to believe Connolly wanted anything other than enough evidence to put him away. If he could get the evidence without having to resort to an investigation, actually doing his job, then so much the better. Nick disliked him immediately. "I don't remember shit." Connolly's smile remained in place. "I don't believe that." He lowered the pad and pen. "Can I speak frankly with you, man to man?" Nick remained silent. "I already know what happened. The broad strokes, anyway. All I need from you is the details." He looked away at the walls and floor and finally out the window. "A young woman is dead, Nicholas. I assume you've heard?" Nick nodded. His mouth felt as dry as his throat. "We already know she was high on heroin, and so are you. Your blood work tells all sorts of tales. I want to know where you got it. Give me the fucker's name, and I'll make sure he pays for this." Nick continued to stare at the ceiling. Connolly walked slowly about the room. He kept his eyes on the floor. "Don't think you're being noble, Nicholas. We know Angela Gray withdrew $200 from her checking account 90 minutes before the collision. The two of you bought it, you smoked it up, and now, here we are. But that's after Ms. Gray effectively demonstrated that law of physics known as fusion. You should have seen her car. It was not recognizable as an automobile." He stopped his walk around the room and placed both hands on the bed's safety rail to Nick's right. "Why would you protect the bastard who sold you that shit? He's partially responsible for her death. Help me do my job and put the prick away for a long time." His tone changed, became warmer. "That's a promise." Nick ignored him. He stared at the ceiling. But what he saw was Angie leaning over in the driver's seat and taking a big hit from the powder burning atop the foil in his hand. Connolly readied his pad and pen. "Give me a name and I'll tell the judge you were cooperative. I'll ask the DA to do me a favor and recommend substance abuse counseling for you instead of prison. Now that's a way out, man. And if you're smart, you'll take it and say thank you." Nick had somehow managed to avoid prison until now. He had been arrested plenty of times, but he had always lucked out when it came to the actual sentence. Although, in those prior arrests, there had been no deaths. Never once had there even been the possibility of it, except his own from an overdose. This was different. This was Angie. "I don't remember everything," he told Connolly. "Just flashes of memory here and there." "Tell me everything you do remember." Connolly's pen hovered above the small pad like a lion about to pounce on a snoozing gazelle. Nick swallowed, felt the pain in his throat. "Get me a glass of water first." Connolly did as he asked. They spoke at length. They were interrupted only once when the nurse, a pretty little thing with short blonde hair, whose ID badge sported the name Elizabeth, entered to swap out his IV bag. By the end of the interview, interrogation, Nick had given Connolly everything he had.